Greetings, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I see that people are logging in from all over the world at different times of the day and night. So thanks for joining us and welcome to today's webinar, which is part of Schulich School's series on shaping the post-pandemic world. My name is Preet Olak, and I'm the Associate Dean of Research at Schulich. I'll be hosting the webinar and moderating the Q&A session. So briefly, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'll go through the agenda. So we'll start with some brief introductions. This will be followed by the formal presentation from a speaker. After that, we'll take your questions. So now it gives me great pleasure in introducing today's speaker, Professor Brent Lyons. Professor Lyons is an assistant professor of organizational studies and the York Research Chair at the Schulich School of Business. His research involves the study of stigma in organizations and how individuals with stigmatized social identities, such as disability, navigate their work and interpersonal relationships to reduce consequences of stigmatization. He's also the director of the Stigma and Identity Lab, in which he works with students and organizations to better understand issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In this webinar, Professor Lyons will explore how the COVID-19 has unequally affected people of different social demographic groups. He'll also consider insights into how individuals and organizations can play a role in addressing inequality to improving the work lives of all its employees. So I hand it over to Brent and welcome to the webinar.
Okay, great, thank you very much. I'd first like to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate you kind of taking the time out of your day to engage in our webinar about inequality and our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd also like to thank Preet, Ashwin, and Vito, and everyone involved in organizing this amazing webinar series. I feel truly privileged to be a part of this amazing event. Before I kind of dive into the topic at hand today, I'd just like to note a couple caveats, do you want to call it, before we dive about inequality from the perspective of research primarily conducted in Canada and the United States. So my main area of research is about organizational behavior and the people in organizations. So I'll mainly be approaching the topic from that perspective. So very much a micro perspective. Irene Henrique gave a talk last week about the economics of the COVID-19 pandemic. And she talked a little bit about inequality in the labor market. So if you're interested in a more macro perspective, I think her webinar was very insightful. I would also like to acknowledge that the topic of inequality can be challenging and uncomfortable for a lot of people for many reasons. And I will be talking about challenging issues today. My goal in doing so is to draw awareness to the inequality that some people might experience as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the organization's role in addressing that inequality. Even though the topics are challenging, I do hope that we can have a fruitful, and why don't we jump in? So on this slide, I have our agenda or the path that we'll follow today. Actually, on the right side of the screen, you'll see a picture of a hiking trail or a path, and that's actually in the Spencer Grove Conservation Area, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, and that's actually where I'm zooming in from. I'm not able to be in Toronto today. And the reason why I chose this picture was because at the end of the last webinar, Ellen Oster alluded to this metaphor of a yellow brick road. And I thought that I would kind of continue with that metaphor and talk about a pathway forward. So I really like that this, what this picture represents. So in our conversation today, I will kind of follow this general agenda. I'll first talk about inequality and what I mean by inequality. Then I'll talk about where we are. So I'll kind of give a lay of the land, and I'll talk about how different groups or communities in our society are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic and how some people are more vulnerable to the negative effects of the organizations to pay attention to. After I've kind of given a lay of the land and where we are, we'll do a poll to kind of get a better understanding of where you're coming from on these perspectives. And then I'll kind of wrap up the presentation by talking a little bit about where us as individuals and organizations and where organizations more broadly might go in addressing inequalities. So I hope to offer some nuggets or insights into what I think may be future areas of consideration for addressing inequality. So the first order of business will be to address what inequality is, and at least what I mean by inequality. So I'd like to start by saying that although COVID-19 can affect us all, and I'm sure many of you have been directly or indirectly affected by COVID-19, inequality is about how COVID-19 has affected certain people differently. Some people are more vulnerable to the negative effects of COVID-19 than others. Although we can talk about how some people are more likely to become sick or pass away from COVID-19, which is an absolutely crucial part of the conversation, another part of the conversation is also how some groups of people are more vulnerable to the social and economic effects of COVID-19 than others. And I actually found the Ontario Human Rights Commission statement on COVID-19 and inequality to be particularly helpful in informing my understanding of inequality. And they list several examples, some of which I have on the slide here, of the ways in which COVID-19 has affected different societal groups in different ways. So when I talk about societal groups, I mean race, gender, income status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, etc. So they talk about how certain segments of society are at higher risk of contracting COVID-19. However, they go on to talk about how acts of overt racism against Asians have become more prevalent since the onslaught of the pandemic. How certain groups are more at risk of losing their employment or being laid off. Also, now that the government is asking people to stay home, we're seeing incidents of family violence and abuse. So the home environment is not necessarily a safe place for everybody. We're also seeing discriminatory enforcement of public health measures, and I'll go into this a little bit more, but there's been concern within the Black community about over-enforcement of these public health measures on the part of law enforcement. And then we're also hearing stories of social exclusion. So people who are feeling lonely or isolated and who don't have networks of people that they can connect with. So the purpose of this is just to show you that inequality can manifest itself in a variety of ways that are very important to consider. And my goal, at least, in understanding COVID-19 from an inequality lens is twofold. The first is that it's to help those people most affected by the pandemic meet their needs and also understand how organizations can play a role in helping these people meet their needs. That is, have a full and fulfilling work life and contribute to organizations and be healthy and happy. The second factor that I think is important and why it's important to consider inequality is that an understanding of inequality can also help organizations become more resilient in coping with future crises, such as if we see another pandemic or crises in the future, or when we see more waves of COVID-19 coming through. So I'll now move on to talking about where we are. So what is inequality looking like in the current or recent state of affairs? I think it's important when we talk about inequality that we use a lens of intersectionality. And Russell Belk, in his webinar a few weeks ago, actually referenced the concept of intersectionality that I found particularly useful. So what do I mean by inequalities are intersectional, or what do I mean by intersectionality? When I say that inequalities are intersectional, what I mean is that inequality can be understood not by considering categories of difference, such as gender, in isolation, but by considering how categories of difference, such as gender, race, and income status, overlap in influencing individuals' vulnerabilities to the negative effects of COVID-19. For example, when we consider the roles of caregivers, and there's a lot of content in caregiving, an intersectional lens would allow us to see that white women may oftentimes have different experiences of caregiving and the disproportionate role that women play in that relationship than, for example, Black women, who, as I will talk about in a little bit, are more likely to be seen as personal care workers or essential workers and may not be able to be home at a regular basis. So it creates a unique set of challenges. So that is to say, it's really useful and important to consider how these different categories of difference overlap in influencing people's experiences of inequality. Now, one example that I have on this slide is a graph from the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences, which is an independent research organization based out of Ontario, Canada. And what they did is they collected data in and around Toronto about people's risk at testing positive for COVID-19. And what they did was they measured things like income status, immigration status, whether or not you're a visible minority. And the results suggest that those people who are most at risk for testing positive for COVID-19 are those who are visible minorities, immigrants, and who live in lower income neighborhoods. Now, the reason why some people have given why we see disproportionate levels of COVID-19 infections in these kinds of contexts is because it could be, for a variety of reasons, people in those contexts are living with more people, they have less space to social distance, and it may also be that they have less easy access to healthcare. Now, what I'd like to do is go through some additional examples of intersectional inequalities. Now, you might already be thinking about how your social identities, maybe your gender, your race, your disability status, your sexual orientation, has played a role in impacting your vulnerabilities to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I certainly am not intending to cover all possible ways in which identities intersect in influencing inequalities. My aim in presenting these ideas is to just draw awareness to the notion of intersectional inequalities and to spur further conversation about how we might understand inequalities. So one example that comes to mind is the concern within the Black community about the over-surveillance of Black people when it comes to law enforcement's enforcement of public health measures. So here I have a picture of Obi Fetty and his daughter, who are residents of Ottawa, Ontario. In April, Obi was assaulted by police officers when they were trying to enforce the physical distancing regulations. Now, there is a broader concern within the Black community about the relationship with the criminal justice system and injustice that occurs and the poor treatment of Black people in the context of that system. So in addition to considering the Black community's relationship with the criminal justice system, we can also consider an intersectional lens. So as I alluded to earlier, we know that Black women in Ontario are more likely to be in personal caregiving roles, which renders them essential, but also puts them at risk, at a higher risk for contracting COVID-19. women of color in general in Ontario are more likely to be in lower paying and more vulnerable occupations like retail and are more likely to be laid off during the pandemic. So here we're seeing intersections of class, race, and gender in impacting how people are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic. Another issue that I've been thinking a lot about and that hits personal to me is the notion of people wearing face masks. Now, I self-identify as a person who is deaf and hard of hearing, and I find myself relying on people's facial expressions and lip reading to kind of understand and navigate the world. So one concern that I have is if I were to become sick or my fellow deaf and hard of hearing community, members of my deaf and hard of hearing community were to become sick, would they have access to resources such that they would be able to ask questions and have appropriate communication with healthcare providers? So in this picture here, I have a healthcare provider wearing a mask. And when I see something like that, I get a little bit anxious because it brings attention to me that I don't know how I would be treated in a hospital setting. And especially if I were lower income, I may not be able to have easy access to support or interpreters, et cetera, that would be able to help me have those kind of conversations with healthcare providers. So that's another thing that I've been thinking about. And a third kind of category of analysis that I've been thinking about are people who identify as sexual minorities, whether gay or lesbian or bisexual, or people who are gender diverse, such as people who are transgender or gender non-conforming. So research suggests that people who kind of identify, for example, as sexual minorities, sometimes use the workplace as a place to kind of present those aspects of themselves, to be open, more open about themselves, where being at home may be a less safe environment or a less comfortable environment for them to do so. But when we're asking people to be at home and in maybe in cramped quarters where there's a lot of people around, it can be very difficult for people who are unable to be themselves. And that's stressful and it can promote anxiety. So I worry about the mental health conditions of people in those kinds of scenarios. So now that we have at least some awareness about the role of intersectionality in understanding inequality, I think it's also important to understand how inequalities shape how people are able to work, bring themselves to organizations. So as I've already alluded to, by virtue of how differences in social life to inequalities, we now might have an understanding that certain people with different demographic groups may face varying levels of uncertainty and anxiety when they come to work or when they're asked to do work from home. So for example, people who are more likely to know someone who has contracted the virus or to know someone who has passed away may feel a particular level of uncertainty or anxiety that can take a toll on mental health, and also unequal access to healthcare or clean water or healthy food can take a toll on people's physical health. People in caregiving roles with different levels of support depending on perhaps their income or where they live or their relationship with family members may be less able to engage in work. They might be more distracted at work. They might be unable to work as well as they did before the pandemic. And all of this is to say that by virtue of inequalities, we're seeing that people are unable to contribute to work and be involved in organizations in the way they used to. Another example might be, and as a professor, I think about this with my students, unequal access to internet connection or reliable internet connection, or unequal access to space where they're actually able to sit down and participate in a lecture or participate in a Zoom meeting, right? So when we think about these inequalities, we can also think about the trauma that is associated with experiencing these vulnerabilities. So I'm sure all of us, or a lot of us here today, may have experienced some type of trauma since the pandemic. And by trauma, what I mean is a distressing experience. Maybe you've been laid off, or you lost your job, or you've lost a loved one, can lead you to feel distressed and start to get you to rethink about what your life is, about who you are and how you're going to move forward. It kind of throws your life into question. And that is a process, and trauma is a process that takes people a long time to something that is ongoing and continues to linger. So when we consider trauma, we might also consider the example of anti-Asian racism. And there's been some news reports about how Asian people in Ontario have been victims of overt anti-Asian racism. And a lot of these people are talking about how that is a source of trauma for them. So towards the end of my presentation, I am going to be talking about trauma. Trauma can have negative effects for people's experience in organizations, but I'll also talk about how organizations can play a role in processing people's, and supporting people as they process their trauma, so that not only individuals, but organizations can grow from people's experiences of trauma. So before we kind of go into what individuals and organizations might do to address inequalities, what I'd like to do is take a poll. So if Vito could launch the poll, and the question is, with whom have you had conversation about inequalities you or someone you know have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm particularly interested in your experiences at your workplace, or if you're a student at school. So have you had these conversations with your supervisor or someone who's in a managerial position relative to you, your peers or your coworkers? Have you had conversations about inequalities from both your supervisors and peers? Or have you not had these conversations at work? So there's no one at work. So let's put this poll up for a minute and we'll see how you respond. Okay, so this is interesting. So what we're seeing from this, small sampling is that the majority of you, or 44%, you said you have not had conversations about inequalities or challenges that you face. You have had conversations, have had those conversations with your peers. Very few of you have had conversations the least number of you have had conversations with your supervisors. So that's interesting. So it sounds like it's not super common to have these kinds of conversations, at least with your supervisors. But what I'm going to do next is argue the important role that supervisors play in addressing inequality and the importance of communication in those efforts. So the first way in which I'll approach how individuals can be involved in addressing inequality is through the lens of leadership. Now, my colleague Winnie Shen gave a wonderful webinar about the role of leaders during the pandemic a few weeks ago. So I'm gonna try and not repeat a lot of what she said, but her webinar was absolutely wonderful, and I recommend you go. In her webinar, in Winnie's webinar, she talked a lot about the importance of communication between people in leadership roles and the people that they work with. And the reason why focusing on leadership is important is because a lot of us will find ourselves in leadership roles in different aspects of our jobs or in our careers. So communication, in Winnie's webinar, she talked about the importance of communication for clearly communicating job expectations to help manage to manage uncertainty. And I echo that, and I think that communication is super important. But I was also wanted to understand communication from the perspective of addressing inequality and the uncertainty or the unequal levels of uncertainty that people for various categories of difference might experience. So in order to better understand the role of communication inequality, I actually looked at the research literature on gig workers. Now, if you're not aware, gig workers are people who are constantly uncertain about the nature of their work, where their next job's gonna come from, when they're gonna get paid. So there's always this level of uncertainty a part of their work. And recent research has looked at how gig workers are able to kind of manage uncertainty. And one way in which they're able to do that is what the research calls, and I give you the citation here on the slide, is cultivating holding relationships. Now, what are holding relationships? Holding relationships are basically those relationships to or express your anxieties or concerns or things that are causing you distress, and also have a conversation with someone who is able to kind of share that with you and also potentially make sense of or interpret different solutions to your anxiety or distress. So basically, you're in a holding relationship when there's someone you can talk to about your anxieties and you can have a conversation about how you might address it. So that's what I mean by a holding relationship. Now, how does this relate to addressing inequality? This relates to addressing inequality because encouraging leaders to cultivate holding relationships encourages them to start conversations that inspire people to bring awareness to the challenges that they're facing, or the aspects or the reasons why inequality might be making them more vulnerable. So I have a very specific example of this. Last week, I sat in on a Zoom meeting of a friend of mine who works at a theater company in Vancouver, British Columbia. And at the very beginning of the meeting, the host of the meeting did what's called an accessibility check, where basically everyone went around the Zoom meeting and said what their accessibility needs were that day or in that meeting. Now, accessibility here does not refer specifically to disability. It refers also to people's childcare needs or whatever issues you may face in order to make you be able to contribute to work and feel healthy at work. So for example, in that meeting, one person talked about they were holding a baby, and one person said that my accessibility need is that I have a baby with me and I may be a little bit distracted during the meeting. Another person said that every hour during the meeting, they will need to have a 10-minute break so they can go outside and walk around. And what I appreciated about this approach or this accessibility check was that it was very quick. The leader did it at the very beginning of the meeting. They started by talking about how they were feeling and then passed it along to everyone else. And it also enabled the leader to learn about the challenge points or the pain points that their team is dealing with, and also work with them to develop a strategy about how they might deal with it. So what the host did in that meeting was say, okay, yep, absolutely, we can be flexible and we can take a 10-minute break every hour. So that's a very nice example of a holding relationship. Not something that takes too much time and encourages us to kind of learn from one another. And from a leader's perspective, employees, you're able to kind of take in that information and think, okay, does our organization have the resources? If this person doesn't have reliable Wi-Fi, can our organization help this person out? If this person is struggling with mental health, does our organization have very clear actionable steps that they might take in order to get help for their mental health, right? Or if our organization doesn't have those resources, that's worth making a note of so that we can better equip ourselves. Now, of course, having those kinds of conversations are difficult, not easy. And one other recommendation I would have for leaders is that it's important to set personal boundaries. And Shannon, her webinar talked about, and setting personal boundaries is about clarifying in yourself as a leader what you're comfortable sharing about yourself and when you're comfortable sharing it. So for example, if you're doing your team meeting at the beginning of the day, maybe that's when you do your check-in, and it only occurs at the beginning of the days in order to kind of prevent yourself from becoming overwhelmed. So now I'll move on to the role of the organization. I will echo what previous webinars have suggested about the importance of data gathering. I think now is an important time to start making efforts to collect data about pain points or challenges that employees might be experiencing around inequalities. So this could include doing surveys, focus groups, or even looking at your policies. Do we have policies or clear resources that can help people deal with their mental health? So I think now is a great time for doing data gathering and using that data to make subsequent decisions. It's good to note that some organizations have already done a good job of this, and they were able to implement policies and practices that were more effective for their employees. Another direction that organizations might go is policies and support resources, making sure that those are clear and accessible. So are you asking yourself the question, how are employees aware of mental health resources, and are they accessible? If they're not, how can we facilitate that? The third component is important, and I think something that we should pay more attention to, and it's this notion of psychological safety and trust. So when I think of psychological safety and trust, I think of myself asking the question, do people feel like they can open up and be vulnerable in this organization? Share a source of challenge or pain points that there could be that employees are not feeling psychologically safe or trusting their leaders or other coworkers in the organization. And that might mean that we might need to look closer at the organizational culture and consider how leadership top-down can convey messaging about the importance of developing psychologically safe and trusting relationships, or if leaders or coworkers are unable to have psychologically safe and trusting interactions, that might be good knowledge so that we can implement developmental opportunities for them. So the last thing I would like to touch on before jumping into the question and answer would be what I alluded to earlier about ongoing trauma. And as I said, trauma is something that is ongoing. We can cycle in and out of processing trauma as we experience more or less distress in our pandemic has kind of lessened a little bit. So recent research suggests, and I give you the citation at the bottom of the slide here, that trauma does not necessarily need to be negative, right? We know that it can have negative implications for people, but organizations can play a role in helping people process trauma. And I'll get into a little bit about why helping people process trauma can help organizations, individuals and organizations grow. So the research I allude to suggests that, or specifically focuses on Black employees who experience trauma when media reports about police brutality against members of the Black community. And they talk about how it's helpful that organizations share about their anxieties and distress and challenges, and opportunities to have conversations with people about how to make sense of this and how they might move forward. And what the research is actually suggesting is that when organizations cultivate those holding environments and create space for processing this trauma, then those Black employees were better able to see themselves as a member of the organization and engage in what's called positive deviance. And positive deviance is challenging the status quo of the organization that makes the organization a better place. So for example, a person with a disability might say, you know, this dining hall is not accessible to me. I've experienced trauma, but I want this place to be a better place. So I'm going to say something and challenge the status quo and maybe make this organization a better place for everybody. So, and helping people process trauma can help individuals grow and the organization grow as well. So with that said, I would like to open the floor up to questions.
Thanks, Brent. So I'm gonna start with a couple of comments and questions related to the difficulty of people to convey their concerns to their employers or to their peers. So I'll start with this, actually it's a comment from Michelle Hughes, who writes that it is difficult to have these conversations at work because whenever you mention any situation or even a conversation, everyone gets silent, maybe because they are uncomfortable or maybe they do not believe it happens, but the silence is loud. So I would like to hear your comments on this.
Yeah, it's true. I think that it's a very difficult issue, and I did not mean to intend to imply that having these kinds of conversations are easy. I think that there are a number of ways we might think about moving forward. I think it's most certainly a hindrance to organizations if the people who are privy to these conversations are unable to be responsive and are unable to create a trusting and psychologically safe response to those conversations. So I think I would like to see organizations kind of, put more effort into developing that as a core competency. I would also like to acknowledge that, yes, those conversations are very difficult. And I think that there's a couple things that people who want to have those conversations might think about engaging in. So the first thing, and I can speak from personal experience, is that it helps to practice how you're going to have those conversations and being very strategic. So you might have a close friend in your personal life who you're able to practice those conversations with. And you may also be able to build coalitions in the organization. So maybe there are other people in the organization who you're able to kind of have easier conversations with. And having these conversations with them, you might be able to learn, okay, this person also knows the organization. They might know other ways in which I may be able to get my voice heard, or other ways in which I can have those kinds of conversations so that they might go a little bit more smoother. But it's absolutely a very challenging issue. And that's why I'm encouraging leaders to kind of really think through this kind of holding relationship component.
There's a related question from Sarah Waki, whose concern relates to the expectations, getting her employer to change expectations because of the COVID, given that her family situation, she's a single mother and she has to deal with a lot of those things. So the question she has is that she's almost thinking of leaving the employee after this COVID is over. So how does one negotiate in those kind of situations?
Right. Again, it's very, very challenging. I think developing coalitions is important. So at the end of my talk today, I'm going to throw up a book that actually talks about this, and it's about navigating challenging conversations at work. And what that book talks about is how you strategically frame the issue. So, or one of the things they talk about is how you strategically frame the issues. So for example, if the issue is that you don't feel like you have enough time to do the work in the way it's traditionally been done, or if you feel like your supervisor is being unfair for you, then perhaps it's worth having a conversation about, I'm able to do work at these points in time, or I'm able to do work in these ways and meet these goals. I just may not be able to do it in the way that it's typically been done. And I'm therefore still able to contribute and contribute to the work and organization. So what you're doing there is kind of aligning your kind of framing of the issue with values and mission of the organization. Like, yes, we care about you wanting to do good work, and we also care about you doing okay. So perhaps we might have a renegotiate or have a conversation about what those competence are, what those metrics are. So maybe you don't need to be in every Zoom meeting. Maybe we can be more flexible as to when you're able to do the work, right? So perhaps there's ways in which you might think about strategically having those conversations. I think finding allies is also really important. So I've talked about coalitions. Maybe there's other people in the organization who you are allies for you who can maybe speak on your behalf. So perhaps strategically leveraging those relationships might also be important, but it's absolutely a very challenging circumstance.
Thanks, Brent. Our next question is from Ushnish Sengupta, who's one of our active participants in most of the webinars. So the question is, US data indicates 40% of individuals with income less of $40,000 or less have lost their jobs during the COVID. Do you think the temporary inequalities caused by COVID-19 will permanently exacerbate inequalities that existed before the crisis?
That's a wonderful question. I think I first start by saying that we need more data, so I wouldn't want to say definitively, because we're kind of in the midst of things. We'll have to wait another couple years or so to see what actually happens. But I was reading a really interesting paper the other day that was talking about how inequality that's already manifest in the way in which we divide up work. So perhaps it's not coincidence that people of color or maybe women of color find themselves in lower paid, more vulnerable caregiving roles, or women of color in certain circumstances find themselves in more vulnerable jobs where they're more likely to be laid off or lose their jobs. Because those systems of inequality are already in place that make it difficult for example, racialized people to kind of obtain jobs that are easier for white men to obtain. So those inequalities already exist across the kinds of jobs that people have. And if people in those more vulnerable jobs that tend to be filled by people who are already vulnerable are losing those jobs, then I would guess that when we're seeing loss of employment, that those inequalities would exacerbate or become worse. But that's my guess.
Thanks. Next question is from Gillian Wells. The question is, what about socioeconomic inequality amidst COVID-19, especially in the area of assumptions of living conditions and access to resources, such as a single mother of 3 children living in an apartment with no balcony? Most of the support for families is based on assumptions of 2-parent household, large house, backyard, etc.
Absolutely. And I'll be a little bit bold here, and I'll say that that's why I think an intersectional analysis is so important in considering intersections of gender and income and socioeconomic status, etc. I think efforts to support families have not sufficiently taken into consideration these different kind of class divides. And I would like to see more attention paid to efforts to better support people who don't have, kind of space, or are kind of in these smaller apartments and who don't have resources. And we see this issue coming up in also conversations in the Indigenous community who, for a variety of reasons, have less access to clean water, have less access to healthcare, and have less access to healthy food. Again, there's another example of I would like to see more resources going to those communities as well. So I think that's why an intersectional analysis is so important in understanding these inequalities.
The next question is a little at the broader level. You've talked about, inequality and ostracization in organizations, but now we are also seeing this at a much broader level, at a state level. So you have in the U.S., foreigners are ostracized. In countries like India, particular religious groups are ostracized because of COVID. So how does one cope with this broader, at the state level issues that are creeping up because of COVID?
That's interesting. So I'm not a macro expert, but I think what I have seen is people. So first of all, I've seen that social media has been helpful in kind of joining people across boundaries, across different locations, different industries. For example, there's a network of employees with disabilities in Ontario that's involves people with from a variety of different industries, and that agency advocates on behalf of people who are across a variety of different agencies. So I would perhaps like to see, or perhaps maybe think about greater attention paid to, and maybe more support for those kind of agencies that are offering support across industries, across sectors.
Okay. So there's a question from Emily Martino who asks, do you see strategies for managing inequalities in COVID-19 on a leadership level lasting beyond the pandemic?
That's a really wonderful question. So I would say that I'm not super optimistic. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for learning here. And I think opportunities like this webinar have been amazing, and we've been doing a lot of learning from one another. But what we know from previous pandemics and what previous speakers in these webinars have talked about is that history doesn't repeat itself, but history does rhyme. Now, I'm not a historian, but what I do know is that when we look at the SARS pandemic, we saw instances of anti-Asian racism then, and then we kind of stopped talking about it. And now here we are during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing more very anti-Asian racism again. So I think stronger leadership would be to kind of be continuously aware and sensitive to these issues, and kind of cater approaches and develop policies and practices that are kind of proactive as these pandemics unfold. But unfortunately, that hasn't been what history has told us has happened. However, perhaps we could wait and see. Perhaps we will learn a lot from this pandemic, and perhaps leaders will learn. So we'll have to wait and see, though.
Okay, thanks. This is the last question from Ushni Sengupta again, and this is related to disabilities. So he asks, Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba have belatedly agreed to collect race ethnicity data on COVID cases. No data is being collected on disability. How do we get organizations and governments to collect and publish data on the impact of COVID-19 on people with disability?
Wonderful question. I think advocacy is really important. I think social media is important. I think what we saw in Ontario was that a lot of organizations focused on supporting the equity of racialized communities in Ontario. We're releasing statements in the media. We're really putting, we're all over social media. We're really putting pressure on the government to start collecting that data, and it seemed to be effective. So perhaps that's a way forward for disability serving organizations as well.
Okay. Thanks, Brent. So do you want to make some concluding remarks?
Sure. Okay. Awesome. So just to kind of final thoughts about what we talked about today. One thing that I thought I would mention would be and this kind of relates to the last question, is how can you be involved in addressing inequality in your workplace? And as some people alluded to, having these conversations is not easy at all, and can be very risky for a lot of people. However, there's a book that I have found particularly helpful in understanding how people are tempered radicals or in changing their organization. And that's by Deborah Meyerson at Stanford. So I recommend you check that out. And for those of you who are seeking more resources and support on equity-informed responses to COVID-19, I recommend you check out this very helpful website. It's called the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health. And there's a lot of really helpful resources on there that, that you might find helpful. So with that in mind, I'd like to end by thanking everyone so much for their participation today. It was such a privilege to be a part of this webinar and to hear your perspectives. And if you have any questions about what I've talked about today, or if you would like more information, please feel free to reach out and contact me. Thank you so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Brent, for this very stimulating session. And so I can thank you on behalf of all the people who joined us. And also I want to thank everyone who took the time to join us today. So just in closing, I would like to bring to your attention our next webinar, which will be happening on Tuesday, when we'll be welcoming Professor Jim Clayton, who will share with us his thoughts on cities and COVID-19. So do join us next Tuesday. Finally, I want to reiterate that Schulich continues to be open to respond to any queries that you may have. You can get more information about the webinar series. Current students can stay up to date with the happenings at Schulich, and prospective students can get in touch about our various programs and admission processes. You can also follow us through various social media platforms. So thanks again. And so with this, I will say goodbye, and I hope to see or have most of you back next Tuesday for another exciting webinar. Thank you.